Welcome back. In the last session, we talked about stone tools and stone tool technology, a much maligned subject, which many people consider not to be very interesting, but I think we learned that it is quite interesting. And a subject which is a little foreign to us, because after all, most of us do not use stone tools in our daily lives. Although, something I didn't mention in the last lecture, but there are surgeons today using obsidian tools, and they're using them for scalpels. They're using them because studies have shown that these tools are sharper and cut more cleanly, and people heal faster from surgery done with these tools than with any surgical steel tools. So that obsidian is re-emerging as a part of our culture, and if they could only figure out a way to manufacture them fast enough, because they have to be made individually, but they could just figure out a way to manufacture them fast enough, probably the next surgery that any one of you went in for, the doctor would be hauling out a stone tool to cut with. But today, or in this session rather, we're going to talk about pottery. And the thing about pottery is that it's always been with us from its time of invention. Unlike stone tools, it didn't go into eclipse. Although some people would say that plastic has taken over for pottery, I still believe that ceramics are very much a part of our lives. So that once ceramics were invented, about 10,000 years ago, they became an important element in human existence. In fact, they very rapidly became the most common element, the most common artifact on archaeological sites. Now, this is partly because they're practically indestructible, but more typically, they are there because people didn't value them very much, and so people threw them away in great quantities. When people were making stone bowls, ground stone bowls, it took hours and hours and months to grind a particular bowl. And if that bowl broke, the owner would do anything possible to preserve that bowl, to fit it back together, to tie it back together, to use it in some way, or to use the pieces in some way. But pots were quick and dirty to make, and when they broke, people threw them away. And you will remember that I told you about a site I worked on in which we found half of a broken pot outside the door in the street and half in a corner of the house. And this kind of treatment of pottery is very, very typical. It breaks, you pitch it. Sort of the way we deal with cheap water glasses. It breaks, you throw it in the garbage. Archaeologists are studying that garbage, and so they're really delighted that people valued pottery as little as they did and that they threw it out as much as they did. Archaeologists are also delighted that pottery is indestructible, although I have to tell you a possibly apocryphal story. I can't believe it's real, but on the other hand, the source that told it originally was, I would say, almost impeccable. And this story is about a site in Afghanistan in which the archaeologist found, it's an area of blowing sand, and the dunes shift every year, and so it's a little, they have to actually survey by the stars in order to find. They aren't excavating there now. Nobody's excavated in Afghanistan for years, but when they did excavate there, they had to use astral fixes in order to tell where they had excavated in the previous year. And they tell a story about making a little mistake one year and not coming down exactly on the excavation, coming down a little ways away on what was clearly another part of the site, and finding a tower which was about 15 feet on a side, a square tower, and about 30 feet high, and was absolutely packed, floor to ceiling, with broken pottery. Because what had happened was, it had originally been used for habitation, and then it had become a rubbish dump, and people had just dumped their pottery and dumped their pottery and dumped their pottery in. And the archaeologist who saw this was dismayed, because nothing could be more daunting than that amount of pottery stratified and well preserved. It had to be dealt with. And if this story is true, luckily Afghanistan fell apart politically shortly after that, and this particular archaeologist was able to go on to something that was a little easier to deal with, and so that tower full of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of pieces of broken pottery is still sitting there under the sand dunes. Now, from the time that it's invented, pottery is used by almost everybody. We don't find a lot of pottery in Southeast Asia for quite a long time, and that's because they had bamboo and other materials that were equally good, but any place that we don't have bamboo or other natural materials, other plant materials that provide the same kinds of containers that pottery provides, as soon as pottery is invented, it's used. After stone tools, it's the oldest human technology. So if stone tools don't turn you on, then you can get turned on by holding a piece of pottery that has the fingerprints of a potter who died 8,000 years ago. It's one of the hallmarks of the Neolithic period when people begin settling down. Pottery would not have been very useful for hunters and gatherers because it breaks too easily. And hunters and gatherers who were moving all the time had to have containers that didn't break, and so we believe that they used mostly skins and baskets, things of that sort. But once you're settled and you're living in a single place, then pottery is useful for you. Doesn't matter if it breaks easily because you can just make some more. As far as we can tell, it was independently invented all over the world. That is, one genius didn't invent pottery and then spread it to the rest of the world, but rather geniuses all over the world invented pottery at the same cultural stage at the beginning of the Neolithic, but at different chronological periods, because the Neolithic begins in different parts of the world in different times. Nobody knows why this invention took place. My theory is that it probably took place a lot of times before it finally took. That is, that people invented this technology. It's a pretty obvious technology in a way, although quite sophisticated, but there was no reason for it. They invented it, but they were moving around and they couldn't use it. And then finally, people began to invent it in a cultural context in which it made sense. And so then it became popular. There are also some places where pottery was invented and then discarded. And there's a site in the Middle East where the people made stone bowls, and then pottery comes along. People use it for 100 years or so, and then they discard it and they go back to stone bowls for a rather long period of time. Obviously, they just didn't like it. It didn't work for them in their culture. They would rather grind stone bowls. So that although to us it looks like the invention of pottery clearly is a step up, progress, better than what was there before, that was not necessarily true of the ancient peoples who first confronted pottery. Many, many, many archaeologists have pondered long and hard about how pottery was invented. And I'm sure that everyone who's listening to this lecture can immediately think of 3 or 4 scenarios which might have led to the invention of pottery. We have no way of testing any of those scenarios. Did somebody line a basket with clay and then the basket fell in the fire and the basket burned and the clay fired? And we don't know. But the archaeologist Ruth Amaran, who works in Israel, in an article written some years ago, came up with information which leads, in any case, to an interesting idea. She was working in a site in Israel and she noticed that the bread-making ovens and the pottery-making ovens were next to one another on a terrace, an outside terrace. And she also noticed that the bread-making pits, and in this case there are the grinding places for grinding flour and so forth are sunk into the terrace, and the places for kneading the bread are sunk into the terrace, that the bread-making pits and the pottery-making pits were next to one another. Now, Amaran doesn't go any further than that. She doesn't say, therefore, but I think that we can spend a minute thinking about this. These two technologies are absolutely parallel. Absolutely parallel. When you make bread, not in the 20th century unless you're a very hard worker and really believe in organic materials, but when you made bread in the Neolithic period, the first thing you did was go out and gather the raw material. You went out and you harvested the grain. And what you ended up with was a basket or a measure full of little hard grains, which then had to be ground into a powder, made into flour before it was usable. When you make clay, again, not in the 20th century, but in the Neolithic period, you went to a clay source and you gathered the clay, and what it was clods of earth. And you brought home a measure full of hard clods of earth, and you couldn't use it until you ground it. So the first thing you do with clay is you grind it and make a powder out of it. Once you've made your flour, the next stage in bread making is to mix water with it. and make a paste. Now, at the period that Amaran is talking about, the flour is not leavened. The bread is not leavened. If it rises naturally. Yeast is not added. So all you're doing is mixing water, and you end up with a paste. What you do with pottery, once you've ground the clay, is you mix it with water, and you make a paste. With bread, the next stage is to take that paste and knead it. And when you're kneading bread, what you're doing is aligning the gluten, breaking down the gluten and aligning the molecules in the flour so that it gets stretchy. People who make bread, yeast bread, know by the feel and the kind of shiny texture when the bread is kneaded enough. You knead it and knead it and knead it, and then you shape it into a shape and you let it sit. After you've mixed water with the ground clay, you have to wedge the clay. Wedging is kneading. What you're doing is knocking out the air bubbles in the clay, because if there are air bubbles in the clay, the pot will explode when it's fired. So you knead and knead and knead and knead the clay until it feels right, until it has the right texture. My mother used to make bread when I was a kid, and she would pick it up and slam it on the counter, wham, to get the air out. And some potters pick up the clay and slam it onto the table to get the air out. Then the clay is shaped, and it's covered, and it's left to sit. It's kind of seasoning. Then, if you're making bread, you may take the bread back at this point, and you may knead it again. You may punch it down and knead it again. But in any case, you shape it into the final shape for baking, and then you let it sit. At this point in pottery technology, you take the clay and you form the pot. And we'll be talking in a minute about different ways to do that. And you let it sit. It has to sit until it reaches something called a leather hard stage. You have a certain amount of the water has to evaporate before you can fire the pot. And when the bread is risen or has seasoned until it is ready to bake it, you throw it in the oven, and it is transformed. This is what is important. It is transformed. When you take that bread out, it is no longer flour and water. It is something else. And with the pot, you put that pot in the kiln, and when it is done, you take it out, and it is transformed because it's hard and useful. You have transformed material. This is different from making stone tools. When you make stone tools, you do not change the basic material. You use it, but you do not change it. When you make pottery, you change the basic substance into something else, something that only the gods can do in mythology. It's an extraordinary invention. And it seems likely that at least in this site in the Near East that Amaran has worked on, those two technologies were developed together. They developed in a parallel way. Now, I am not saying that pottery technology led to bread, the invention of bread, or that bread technology led to the invention of pottery. I'm simply saying that they're parallel, and it's very interesting on this site that we have evidence that they were being done in the same place. And it just may be that the whole idea of being able to transform materials arises in culture at about the same time, and people start experimenting with all kinds of materials, and they learn they can transform flour, and they learn they can transform dirt. Pottery is important archaeologically. I have to tell you that my own archaeological work was in pottery analysis, and so I love the stuff. But pottery is important in archaeology because it is the main datum that we use for sequence dating, cross dating, seriation, because it can be used for thermoluminescent dating. So not only is it the main relative dating material that we have, but it also can be used for absolute dating. And if you love it, you really love it. Pottery people are a kind of breed apart. I think the reason we love it is that we feel we are directly in contact with the ancient potters, not only because we can see their fingerprints, but because when you pick up a pot, it fits into your hands in a way. It was made by hands. It was made to be used by hands, and it fits into your hands. You can feel the hands of the ancient people. You can feel the way it was designed. You can feel the construction. You can tell where the ancient potter had problems, where the ancient potter failed and where the ancient potter solved those problems and how. And finally, by looking at the development of shape and the development of decoration, you can see how styles change and how people invent things and they like them and they don't like them and they take off in some places and they don't take off in other places, and some of them get exported and others never go anywhere. It's an incredible window, I think, into the past. And for that reason, I am never bored, no matter how many hundreds and hundreds of little broken pieces of pottery I have to sort and study. Now, when I am classifying pottery, or indeed when anybody is classifying pottery, there are three main ways that the pottery is classified, and the first is by construction method. This is maybe the most basic. Modern potters, if you go to take a pottery course, you can take pottery courses in three different construction techniques: handmade pottery, wheel-made pottery, and molded pottery. Handmade pottery is the oldest pottery, and you might see terms or hear terms such as built or slab or pinch or coil used when people are talking about handmade pottery. The easiest way to understand handmade pottery is to remember when you were in kindergarten and you made a bird's nest. And you made the bird's nest by taking modeling clay and rolling it out until you had a long, narrow, snake-like piece. And then you coiled it round and around and around. And if you were clever and the clay was of the right consistency, you actually were able to bring the sides up. And so you were able to make a very shallow little dish, and then maybe you made your bird out of little round balls of clay that you stuck together and put in the bird's nest. Well, that's exactly the way coil-made pottery is made. What the potter does, and I will tell you now that I'm going to refer to potters as she, and the reason I'm doing that is that there is a fair amount of evidence that in most cases pottery was made by women. Not enough evidence for us to say absolutely that pottery was made by women in all cases, and certainly not enough evidence to say that women invented pottery. But in the present, in most cultures, women are the potters, and there is evidence in the past that in most cultures, until pottery becomes specialized, until it becomes factory-made or becomes a specialized cottage industry, but when people are making their own stuff in the Neolithic period, when most people are making things, the village potters are women. So what the woman potter does is she coils the clay. She rolls the clay out and she begins at the bottom and she coils it up, and as she coils, she smooths the pot, because she doesn't want a pot that looks like a bird's nest. She wants a pot that has smooth sides. And she can bring it up and up and up, and good potters working in this coil technology today can make pots that stand 3 feet high. If you want to know if a piece of pottery that you're holding is wheel-made, all you have to do is put your hand on the inside and draw your hand up the inside of the pot, and you'll be able to feel the lumps of the coils. Because whereas it's very important to smooth the outside, it's not so important to smooth the inside. So the potter doesn't generally spend as much time on the inside, and so you can feel the coils and you can feel how wide they are and how the potter adjusts the width of the coils at different parts of the pot, how she narrows the coils sometimes and broadens the coils sometimes. You can really follow the process of building that coil-made pot. The second category, wheel-made pots. The wheel is invented later than handmade pottery. It often doesn't turn up until we're into the Bronze Age. And what a wheel does is provide a surface on which the clay rests, and the surface turns, which means that the potter doesn't have to go around the pot, coiling around the pot, but the pot turns, and all the potter has to do is work in front of herself. The earliest wheels we think were what we call a slow wheel, and there have been some studies of living potters, country potters working in the backwoods of various countries. So when I say country potter, I mean as opposed to a city potter or a factory potter. And these women use little square pieces of wood, and in some cases they're on a rock or a round it's not really a gear, but it sits on a curved or rounded piece of something, generally a stone. And with her feet, she turns the wheel a quarter turn as she coils. So the pot is something between wheel-made and coil-made. Or another model, she sits a piece of wood on her thigh, And with one hand, she turns the wood, and with the other hand, she coils and smooths the pot. But when you have a true wheel, the platform is run in another way. You treadle, like a treadle sewing machine. That's called a kick wheel. Modern wheels are run by electricity, or you can have another source. You can have somebody who's moving the wheel for you. And the wheel spins around, and all you do, sounds easy but it isn't, is stick your hand into the middle of a ball of clay and you just draw up. And because the clay is spinning around, what you get is a replication around the entire pot of whatever you're doing in front of you. And so in this way, effortlessly, as you know if you've ever watched potters work, you simply create the most amazing pots, wonderful shapes. Wheel-made pot, you can tell a wheel-made pot immediately by looking at it, because as the wheel spins, the grooves in the fingers of the potter leave very, very fine, that is what makes up your fingerprints, leave very, very fine grooves on the surface of the pot. You can always see those on the inside and generally see them on the outside of ancient pots. When you begin to get heavy glazing, then those things are covered up. And finally, there's molded pottery, which really doesn't come in until the Romans. Molded pottery is factory-made. Most potters are very scornful of molded pottery. What you do is you take liquid clay, you pour it into a mold, and then when it dries, you take the mold off and you fire it. It's the way that modern ceramics are made. So if you have earthenware in your home, it was made by pouring liquid earthenware into a mold. Nobody, unless you have earthenware that was actually made by a potter, and you know that, unless you have that, you don't have pottery that human hands ever touched, really. You have pottery that was made in a factory-like way. So the first way of dividing pottery is by method of construction, the simplest way. Go home and look at what you have and see if you have any handmade stuff at home or if it's all wheel-made and molded. The next way is, how is it fired? Was it fired in a pit, which is a primitive way, or was it fired in a kiln, an oven? Was it fired at a low temperature, which is a more primitive way? Or was it fired at a higher temperature? And the way we tell temperature is we look at a cross-section of the pot and we see if it's fired all the way through. If it's not fired all the way through, then it was probably fired at a lower temperature, because the heat wasn't hot enough to fire the pot all the way through. So we see a color variation across the cross-section of the fabric of the pot. And then the third thing, the third way that archaeologists classify pottery is by fabric, and fabric is what the vessel is made of. It's the clay plus whatever is added to it, plus the temper, which can be vegetable matter or it can be minerals, grit, sand. All of these things are added to pots in order to make the clay more plastic, make it hold together better in the firing. And it's particularly useful for archaeologists if straw or other vegetable matter has been used for temper, because when it burns out, it leaves an impression, and sometimes botanists can study, and they can actually tell the kinds of grain that were around at the time, looking at the molds that are left in the clay when the temper burned out. When you're studying fabric, you also may look at the color, the hardness, the surface treatment. Is it smoothed? Is it slipped? When you slip a pot, you cover the surface with a thin paint made of the same clay usually as the pot, and it just fills in all the air holes and makes for a smoother surface. Is it burnished? Burnishing is the earliest technique we have for making pots shiny. What you do when you burnish a pot is take a piece of wood or a piece of cloth or a pebble and you rub it on the pot. What you're doing in terms of the physical pot is you're aligning the molecules on the surface so that when the light comes in, it bounces off and it looks shiny. They're quite beautiful. Burnished pots have a kind of soft, silky, shiny surface, and I know pots should neither be soft nor silky, but compared to, say, a glass-based glaze, which is hard and shiny, burnished pots have more texture. I like them better. They're nicer to feel in the hand. And finally, archaeologists divide pots by shape. Now, this division by shape is particularly difficult because it's really partly objective and partly subjective. That is, archaeologists very typically come up with jugs and juglets. Well, what is a jug and what is a juglet? That's an arbitrary decision. But other decisions are not arbitrary. For instance, archaeologists will classify pots as opened or closed. An open pot is a bowl or a cup. A closed pot is a jug or a jar. And the way you tell, if you don't have the whole pot, is that the inside of an open pot is finished, but the inside of a closed pot is not. So that if you have a sherd and it's only finished on one side, then you assume it belongs to a closed pot. Another way is to look at the angle of curvature and the thickness of the walls, to look at the design of the base, which can be everything from a ring base, which you are very familiar with because most saucers have ring bases, to something called a trumpet base or a knobbed base or a stump base. These are very strange bases that pots can't stand on, but that the pot was finished with. And if you find something like a knob base, then you begin to wonder how this pot was used. Was it hung? Was it sunk into the ground? Because you know it can't stand up by itself. You look at the neck. You look at the rim. Is it a flat rim? Is it angled in? Is it angled out? Does it flare out? Does it go straight up? You look at the handle, which can be everything from a little piece of clay stuck on the side of the pot, which really wouldn't allow you to lift it and is more decorative than anything else, to wonderful loop handles, big handles that let you pick the pot right up. And you look at the spout if it has a spout and the shape of the spout. And then you look at it by style. You look at the decoration. You look at whether it's painted or incised or applied. And when you've looked at all of that stuff and pushed all those hundreds of sherds around on that table or in that computer until you've done your typology and you have groups at the end, you've gotten down to your groups at the end, your clusters of attributes, you have wares. So archaeologists refer to pottery wares or ware types. A ware type implies a set of attributes. So when you say to somebody red polished 2 bowl, a red polished 2 ware bowl, that person knows you're talking about a handmade, slipped and burnished, low-fired bowl of a certain color range, because that's how that ware is defined. Or when somebody says to you a red polished 2 incised bowl, you know that you're working with a handmade, slipped and burnished, low-fired bowl with incised decoration that has been filled with white paint. You know that because those are the attributes used to define that ware. And so the first thing archaeologists have to do is simply create wares or identify wares on their sites, because they can't talk about the pottery or compare the pottery across sites until they have defined those wares. Now, as I mentioned, handmade pottery is the oldest and the most time-consuming. And when we find handmade pottery, in fact, when we find any pottery, we can look at that pottery for some indications of the economic patterns of the culture. Handmade pottery suggests small-scale production on the part of part-time specialists. So maybe there are 3 or 4 women in the village who make the best pottery, but they make it when it's needed. They may make a little extra pottery, but probably not very much. They make it part-time. Wheel-made pottery, which appears about 3000 at the beginning of civilization in the Near East, and is the most common kind of pottery today, has potential for mass production. You can snap out a lot of pots faster using a wheel than you can coiling them. And so what we typically believe when we see wheel-made pottery is that we have a culture which has full-time potters who manufacture for widespread market distribution. It's very rare to find widespread market distribution of handmade pottery, and very rare to find wheel-made pottery which seems to be made on a part-time basis and stays only in the village. And when you have molded pottery, which, as I mentioned, comes last, it's very indicative of mass marketing and mass production. So that Roman mass-produced pottery is all over the Roman world. It all looks exactly alike, one piece from another, and when you fall over it on a beach or trip over it on a site, you recognize terra sigillata immediately. Now, we can also learn social and behavioral information from pottery. Pottery in itself implies settled village life, and I've said that. So you know, if you find pottery on a site, you know it's not a seasonal site. You know it's a settled site. And it also implies the beginnings of craft specialization. But one of the things that archaeologists can do is look at where on the site the pottery is produced. They can see if it's a cottage industry or not. Is there a pottery kiln in every house? Or are all the pottery kilns in one part of the village? And what does that tell us about how the pottery is made? Can we recognize a dozen different hands in the pottery? Not fingerprints, but the kind of style. Or only one? And we begin to then question how craft in general is organized in this village. So then we begin to make assumptions about things that have disappeared, like weaving and wood making, those things that we no longer have physical evidence for. The number of pots that you find on a site in some ways reflects the size of the population. So that if you have a site with no cemetery attached, and it's heavily eroded so that you're not sure about how many houses there were, you can look at the pottery collection and make a very rough estimate about the population based on the number of pots. But we also need to remember that in some cultures, pottery is more important than others in other cultures. So that's a difficult correlation to make, because you may just have a site where they adored the stuff, or you may just have a site where they didn't use it much. So there's not necessarily a direct correlation between the number of pots found on a site, or the frequency with which you find pottery, and the number of people who live there. We try very hard as archaeologists to determine function, and it's always difficult for us. We assume that pots that have necks and lips were used for storing and serving liquid, and we just assume that based on the fact that pots that we use today to store and serve liquids have necks, handles, and lips so that we can pour the liquid. We assume that large jars with wide mouths are used for storage because until recently, we stored food over the winter in large containers with large mouths so we could get down into them. We assume that if we have a very coarse fabric, or if we have a blackened exterior, that the pot is a cooking pot. We assume it because the fine wares that we have, we don't cook in our best china. The cooking wares that we have are simpler and heavier and less well decorated than our fine wares, and so we make an assumption back to the past, and if it's blackened, we assume it sat in a fire, and then we assume it was used to cook. And if we have a small, narrow cylindrical, we assume people drank out of it because it is the same shape as our modern cups or glasses. But all of those assumptions are pretty tenuous. They're based on uniformitarianism. We can argue them. Most people will agree about them, but nonetheless, it's possible that they're totally wrong. In some cases, though, we do have more direct evidence about the function of the pot. For instance, some kinds of pottery are found in very specific places. Certain kinds of pottery are only found in graves. They had no function in the culture. They're never found in habitations. They're grave goods. They were made for the grave, and the most well-known of these are from the classical period in Greece, but we also have them in other periods where special kinds of ceremonial vessels were made to go along into the grave, and one assumes to go along with the soul or the dead person or whatever the concept is into the next stage of existence. Some vessels are almost always found in grain storage bins. When we find a vessel in a grain storage bin, we assume it's a scoop or is used in some way to move grain from one place to another. There are perfume jars in Egyptian tombs, and we know they're perfume jars because there's perfume left in them. Perfume residue, you can't put it on and wear it, but it can be studied chemically. We know the composition, and we know that it is perfume. We also find pots that have residue of food storage or cooking. For instance, if grain bins or big storage jars are made and not completely fired, and the grain is dumped in, sometimes the grain adheres to the inside, and so we can see it. And most interestingly, we have a new scientific analysis technique which helps us understand the use or the function of pottery. Now, this is called lipid analysis. And this is how it works. It's a microscopic analysis of the fatty residues from food and other substances that are absorbed into the fabric of unglazed pottery during the time that it's used. So it works in the Neolithic because they don't have glazes yet. So what happens is you fill your pot with yogurt, you use it, it breaks, you throw it in the garbage, I dig it up, I take it to a scientist, the scientist looks at the inside and tells me you had yogurt in it. Or tells me that it was used to store animal fats. Or tells me that it had fish oil. Or tells me that there were vegetables stored in this pot. And the scientist can also tell me if this was a multi-purpose pot and if both fish and animal oils were stored in it. This is a wonderful new technique, and it promises to tell us an enormous amount about the function of pottery. It's very new, not much has been tested using it yet, and since it only works for unglazed pottery, it will not be very helpful in the later periods once glazing is invented. Just as stone tools can tell us information about cultural contacts and trade, so can pottery. In the first place, if we have two sites or more than two sites that are far apart and they have pottery that looks pretty much alike, it suggests to us that those people from those two sites were in contact. It suggests to us that they influenced one another. We don't know for sure, but we believe they influenced one another. Then we take a look at the sources of the clay. Every clay bed has its own fingerprint, just as every quarry has its own fingerprint. And it's possible to analyze the clay in clay beds and then to analyze the fabric of pots and to identify exactly what clay bed is the source of the fabric for each pot. Now, this is done through something called neutron activation analysis. It was invented about 20 years ago. What's really interesting is that this kind of analysis can help solve a problem. Did the pots move, or did the potters move? Now, the assumption is always that the pots moved. That I made the pots in my village, and then they got traded to another village. Or in some cases, they got traded to another country. They got traded across water. They got traded over mountains. But what we have learned recently is that in many cases, the potters moved. And the potters are completely indistinguishable from the native population in any other way except the fact that they're making pots that look foreign but that are made locally. So what happens in this case is that somebody comes into contact in some way with pottery made in a place away from that person's village and likes it and wants it. And instead of buying the pots and importing the pots, that person imports a potter who uses the local clay but the foreign technique and design and produces local imitations of the pots that she made in her original village. Imitations only in the sense that they're made of a different fabric. Several theories about the development of pottery and the movement of people in the Iron Age in particular were simply turned on their heads in the 1970s by neutron activation analysis, in which long-held theories about this country being a backwater and this country being the center of culture were completely changed when we discovered that far from being a backwater, this country was actually producing most of the pottery that the major center was using. And we could tell that based on neutron activation analysis. And then we can look at trade in the same way we looked at obsidian trade. We can trace vessels, particularly fine where Mycenaean pottery was traded very, very heavily around the Aegean. And you can trace Mycenaean pottery and the percentages of Mycenaean pots that you find the same way that we were tracing obsidian tools, and you can actually watch the kind of trade. If you have a ship and you have a shipwreck, you can trace the final voyage of the ship based on the pottery that the ship has. In the case of the Kyrenia wreck that I mentioned earlier in the course, she picked up amphora, which are pointed bottom storage jars. She picked up amphora at different Greek city-states, and these amphora have the name of the city-state stamped on them, so we know where they came from. And they were clearly full of different materials. And she traded some of those amphora, and they probably consumed the materials in others of those amphora, the ones containing oil and wine and grain. And when she went down, the amphora, which were being used as ballast in her bottom, all landed on the surface bottom of the sea, and they were all excavated. And the archaeologist was able to look at the percentages of amphora from different city-states, and in that way reconstruct where she went. And I might say that if a diver had picked up one of those amphora and taken it home to put on his mantle, and that amphora was the only one from a given city-state, then she didn't go there. That part of her voyage is lost. In this particular case, the Kyrenia wreck, we don't think it was looted. Pottery can also help us understand if grain and animals are domesticated. Do we find grain, evidence of grain in storage jars? If so, it's probably domestic, because you probably can't gather enough to store large quantities. We sometimes find food processing equipment. Some very shallow trays found in Greece have been called olive oil settling trays because they look a lot like modern settling tanks for olive oil. They have a hole at the bottom you could put a cork in and then pull out to let the heavier residues go out, leaving the lighter oil on the top. We don't know if that's what they were used for or not, although now with lipid analysis you might be able to tell what if actually animal or plant fats were used. Sometimes in mud plaster, the mud plaster that is used on the houses, we find the imprints of grains. And that tells us something. Mud plaster isn't fired pottery, but nonetheless it's clay, and it falls, for the purposes of this course, into this lecture. That will tell us something about domestication. So what we know is that after its invention, pottery provides more information about ancient life than any other artifact. It tells us the kinds of activities that people undertook. It tells us the kind of decoration that they wanted. It tells us the importance of certain people, because sometimes in tombs we find people with fine wares or imported wares, and that may be the only evidence that this is a tomb of a richer person than another tomb. It tells us something about belief structure. It tells us about the level of technology. It could tell us about trade. It provides the basis for our the second most basic dating techniques after stratigraphic dating, and that is sequence dating, cross dating, and then seriation. So pottery is invaluable. And I always feel kind of sorry for the people who work on the aceramic sites, even though they have wonderful stone tools to play with, because they don't have pots. Well, in the next session, we are going to examine what we can learn not from artifacts, but from ecofacts. We're going to look at what we can learn from bones.